Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. Today I felt like doing something fresh since I've been doing a ton of content on mostly just chord stuff recently with my usual format of videos, but I understand it could be a lot sometimes on all of us, so all I want to do here is just share a cool linear phrase with you guys and break down some of the unique components of it that contribute to the phrasing and overall musicality of the idea. And in addition, I want to make a few points on what sorts of things we may want to be focusing on when we're actually creating or coming up with these types of ideas ourselves that you may perhaps find intriguing or beneficial. So make sure to stick around to not miss anything, and if you're digging the video, it'd really mean a lot to me if you gave it a like and consider becoming a subscriber as well, and I hope you enjoy. So first things first, I just want to go ahead and give this phrase to you raw right now so that you can literally hear what we're going to be talking about and getting into. Alright, so here it is. 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, and this is a tricky phrase to get clean, the way I want all the way through, but I'm doing the best I can. And also, pardon the tone, because I really need to change the strings on this guitar as well. So, this is a 4-bar phrase that I worked out myself over what is essentially the same harmonic progression as what we see in the first 4 bars of the second half of the standard I Should Care. So, basically these changes. 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? And just a side point for those who don't know, the changes at this point in this tune that I just played are really just an evolved, slightly different harmonic variation on what was originally more so what we see in the first 4 bars of the first half of this tune, alright? And the idea I worked out actually works over the original version as well. It's really just the first bar that's different. It's the D minor 7 to G7 versus the F sharp minor 7 flat 5 to B7, but probably say a little bit more on that in a bit. But when I came up with this, I had the variation in mind. That's what I was thinking with the F sharp half diminished. Alright, so before we do actually get into the phrase itself, for the harmonic component, it would probably be a good idea to have a basic understanding of the functional harmony that's going on with this pretty common progression, alright? So this is something that we may see in jazz, and it's a pretty extended variation on what we may label as a cycle progression with a tonal center of C major. And for most of it, it's pretty standard and diatonic. If we skip the first bar, from bar 2 on, we have the E minor 7, A7, D minor 7, G7 to C major, right? So that's your standard 3, 6, 2, 5. And I would still say that's all diatonic. This is a pretty obvious point but for those who may be, more beginners, like something like that A7, the 6-7 chord, even though it's a secondary dominant and is not technically diatonic to the key, the way it's working and how common that is, I don't really see that as like non-diatonic, alright? Even the B7 that comes before the E minor, it's the 5 of the 3, I guess, but, that root note is still diatonic. We have that 5 to 1 motion, that's still part of the key, but even this B7 is, almost less common than this A7, but I digress. So, from there, though, this cycle progression becomes, not truly diatonic, but it's still functional because we put this F sharp half diminished, alright? Because if we were to keep it diatonic, we would have the F major, right? You can do that. That's because the root is a tritone. It's more similarly related to the, the 7 chord anyway. But it's really just the start of the cycle, and I guess the point of this is if you're going to solo over this, if you wanted to think melodically, even though a chord like this F sharp half diminished isn't, diatonic to C major, it's being very functional within the context that it's acting within in C major. So I'm not saying that you just have to think C major when you play on that chord, but it's just good to be aware. And also, as I'm sure some of you guys already know, that F sharp half diminished chord, if you took the root and lowered it, it would just be the 4 chord anyway, the F major 7, so it's a pretty close related sound anyway with a different root. And also, if we put like a C in the bass, like the tritone of that, it's basically like a C Lydian type of sound, because we'll get the sharp 11, you know, the 3rd and the 6th, so it's like a Lydian with the 13 as well. And that tonality is the key of G major, which is, you know, that's what the 7 chord is. It's F sharp half diminished, right? So those two chords are kind of related. So it's similar almost to like a 1 chord, to, you know, grammatically moving down to the 6 and then, you know, 2 5 1 back, right? So I've said too much, but that's basically what's going on with the progression there, pretty diatonic. So since I already have been talking about the harmony, let's start with that. Although not the most interesting part of the phrasing within this line, but let's see what we got, all right? So I'm coming in actually on the and of 4 before bar 1 with this C, all right? And if I'm thinking about it, because it's like a syncopation or an anticipation of the harmony in the next bar at the beginning, which is the F sharp half diminished, right? So that C is your flat 5, or chord tone of that chord, and then this is the 3rd, all right? So really just chord tones, all right? We'll get to the rhythm and the phrasing afterwards, all right? Now from here, I hit that note again, and then on the B7, you know, this is still just kind of like a flourish. It's the flat 9 of the B7, but I'm mainly playing this B augmented triad, okay? And that works over a dominant chord. You know, if you think of like a B7 sharp 5, well, there's a B augmented triad in there, right? So it's totally valid, you know, altered type of a dominant sound. And it's also interesting because, like I said, if we look at this compared to the harmonic variation that we see in the first half of this tune, if we looked at those notes over that, instead of F sharp half diminished to B7, D minor to G7, well, D minor, there's your flat 7, there's your 5th, so that's a chord tone. And then from here, B augmented triad is the same thing as G augmented triad. So it literally is like the same sound, and it's interesting how those two sort of 2-5 type of progressions connect because of that. You know, the keys where you have a G7, which is C major, and B7, which would technically be E major or E minor, but the augmented triad kind of connects it, so that's cool, all right? And another way of seeing how these two harmonic variations can be related is if we take the F sharp half diminished chord and look at it over a D root note, because the original chord is D minor, well, that just kind of gives you like the D7 chord. So it turns the first chord into a D7 instead of a D minor, so it's like a 2-7, so it's kind of related, still a 2 chord. And then instead of the G7, we're playing B7. Now, B7 related to D7, they're a minor third away, so those two dominants are kind of related through their family, you know, with the diminished, all right? So I don't want to get too into that, but it's almost like the B7 leads you to the E minor, and like this D7 is just another dominant chord that is related to it through a diminished, so I can move D7 to B7, and then that, all right? So it's interesting to note how these two different harmonic variations relate like this, because these two key centers for the major minor, they're not related, because the 2-5 in the key, the D minor to G7, if we think about the 2-5 to the relative minor, it would be B half diminished E7 to A minor. So that's a different key than F sharp B7 to E, right? But they still kind of relate through these interesting augmented as well as diminished relationships, all right? But this stuff in actuality isn't even that important for, you know, this whole phrase, so let's keep it going. So moving along now to bar 2, we have the E minor 7 to A7. So for the E minor, I have, and I land on that, right? And that's basically just a straight up E minor triad, you know, starting on the 5th and walking up to it, except then I land there. So it's like a voice leading thing from a phrasing point of view. And I'll just point out a little bit now when it comes to the phrasing of this. You know, I'm hearing this idea. It's a pretty, you know, cliche or stereotypical line that you may get in the jazz language lexicon, and you can kind of hear that upper voice sort of moving down like a line cliche type of thing, right? So it's kind of moving like that, and the ear picks up on it, and it sounds good. I'm just kind of harmonizing underneath with whatever the harmony is and making sure that it fits rhythmically and is harmonically appropriate, right? So when I land on that, it's the and of 2, but it's an anticipation of the next chord, like a 5-chord A7, we could see it as the flat 9, but going into it, the way I often might see it, because I'm coming from an E minor triad, a diminished that relates to A7 obviously is B flat diminished, which is the same as E diminished, so it's almost like E minor to E diminished. I like to see it like that sort of movement for phrasing purposes and simplicity, you know, flat that 5, all right? So that's how I'm kind of sort of expressing that sound harmonically. And then once I'm on that, it's basically like an A7 altered, you know, it has the flat 9 and the sharp 9, flat 7 and root. So it's just straight up outlining like a A7 altered chord right there, which is perfect leading into a D minor or 2 chord, all right? So now at the end of that, on the and of 4, all right, now that note is really in anticipation of the next bar and what's going on, and this is actually harmonically an interesting thing going on here. We may say that this is sort of breaking the rules of convention in terms of what a lot of us may have learned, and for good reason, is stuff that usually is what sounds good or might be musically correct, like the thing to do. And what I'm talking about is the idea of, you know, usually as a foundation having chord tones, like the main fundamental 1, 3, 5, 7 of a harmony, falling on the strong downbeats, beat 1 and 3 in particular, to basically clearly outline the harmony so that the people can hear what you're doing and you're basically playing the changes right and it sounds good. So if you don't do that, perhaps, you know, it may not sound accurate, like you're not really expressing the harmony accurately, and it may not sound good, but for whatever reason, sometimes everything depends on context and phrasing and everything, you know, you can still do things that totally negate that pretty clearly and still sound good. So here on the and of 4, it's coming in there and it's still, you know, being held into the downbeat of 1. This is D sharp or E flat. If we're thinking about the harmony it's anticipating, D minor, it's like the flat 9 of like a 2 chord, which is totally off. Like that is not a note that should sound good there, but within the context of the phrase, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's basically leading you to the E natural, which is like the 9, like a D minor 9, so that sounds good, but that's still not even the 1, 3, 5, 7, but it works. But within the context, it's really leading you to the downbeat of 3, right? Within the context of a G7, it would be the flat 7, but also for D minor, still the flat 3rd, so that chord tone is good, right? And it's basically like an enclosure type of a phrase. That's why it works, all right? Pretty recognizable, all right? And then from there, the second half of this phrase is, again, like a pretty cliche type of phrase that I've heard and played, you know, stuff like this before, right here, right? Now, because we have this C major tonal center that we're resolving to, normally we may hear this phrase to resolve to something like that, like the 3rd of C major, which is perfect. But what I do, right now, this is what you would normally think is the flat 3rd, not correct, but if you think of the you know, variation of a major, like a major 7 sharp 9, which is a cool sounding major chord, if I want to do that, a way to sort of get that sound is to think of the triad, the major triad that is built on the root that's down a half step from the root of the original chord. So if the original chord is C and the root is C, I go down a half step to B, so B major triad, you know, that harmony over C major gives you like a cool major 7 sharp 9 sound. So when I'm resolving to, okay, that's your straight up B major triad. And then the second half of this, right? Now, obviously we have a C major triad in C major too, but instead of making it obvious and going more like B major to C major, something like that, what I do is I basically am thinking B major triad to E minor, which is related to C major. It's the 3 chord anyway. Right here. Right? Root, 5th, flat 3rd. And then I land on this, which is the 6th of the chord, but just to kind of keep it going. You know, the phrase could continue, it's the end of it now, but it's a nice note to end on there, I suppose, for now. So basically, okay, right? And it's cool, basically, to kind of see that device from a harmonic perspective. For a major chord, you can think of the triads in C major, in this case, B major and E minor, and kind of use the right inversions that would voice lead next to each other and sound good, right? Now, I'm not overthinking that so much, and that's a good point that brings me into, the rest of this. We're going to talk about the rhythm and the phrasing, because we could take a look at the rhythms or even the use of that, like that hip harmonic sound, and think like, oh, that's really cool, like that you like use those ideas or whatever. But when I'm coming up with this stuff in the moment, especially the beginning parts of this, how am I coming up with this phrase? Like even up to there, for sure. I'm coming up with that by thinking about or listening to the harmony I'm playing over, right? And literally, this is what I'm thinking. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? The point is, it's like I always say, like it's something that you might sing. I'm feeling it, and this is for this reason also why if I get really excited about my own phrases and talk about them, like I think they're cool, it doesn't even, like, in my opinion, come off as like an egotistical thing to do, because to me, like, I'm just hearing this stuff and it's coming from the divine. It's not like I'm trying to play this, especially if I'm like really tapped in and listening and just trying to hear what's around me and play something that sounds good and is musical. I know I'm going on about this, but it's really important, I think, to realize this stuff, because, even all the harmonic stuff that I discussed already, I'm not thinking about any of that stuff. Now, sure, when I work stuff out, because I may not perfectly be hearing everything at first, but that sort of cliche phrase and bringing it down to da 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 da, it's something that's been, done many times, and we can be familiar with that sound. So because I have an idea, I can sit down with it and work it out, and I'm basically just sort of following along the harmony. The fact that I might have like an augmented triad, it's not like I'm trying to be cool with an augmented. It just seems to be what works to keep that, voice leading moving down, all right? But one thing that is interesting to kind of point out if we're talking about the harmonic component is, I think if you're trying to compose phrases and you're starting out with an idea that you're hearing really clearly in your head, as you start to work it out and you go into it and get towards the end of it, I think it could have more of a tendency to be more thought out or cerebral, because you have to sort of like finish the idea and you have to like sort of figure out what works. Almost as if you're like doing a counterpoint exercise, where the initial opening bars, if that's where you're starting from, it's more like inspirational, so the idea is already there. You just have to kind of like work it out and figure out what notes exactly you're really hearing and, make it refined so that it's correct. So if we look at stuff like the rhythm and the articulation and phrasing now, I'll actually start with the end to kind of further that point. It's not a surprise to me that the last 2 bars of this rhythmically are just eighth notes straight through, almost just trying to complete the idea, where the first 2 bars are obviously more rhythmically, interesting. But let's take a look at what it is. So we open with some syncopation, anticipating the downbeat of beat 1. And obviously syncopation is a good thing for this music to create the forward motion. So it just keeps it interesting and moving with all those upbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Before it leads you to that, the interesting rhythm there, right? So what do we have? We have a 16th note triplet and an eighth, right? You could look at that and be like, oh, that's kind of hip. But the point is, again, I'm not trying to do any of that at all. It's literally just working out what I hear in my head and make sure that the rhythm is totally clean and accurate, right? And fitting in the harmony. So then if we look at the next bar, we have some interesting stuff again with the syncopation on the end of 2. We have 1 and 2, right? So it's anticipating the A7 with the flat 9, I suppose. But then I'm also tying that to the 16th note triplet, right? And these, the notes are good, but I just am trying to make notes that rhythmically fit so that the cool notes land in the right place. And I think originally I didn't do it like that. I think I was trying to do it more with like a, without an extra note, but I wanted to get the feel of that extra note and still have that weird note on the end of 4 there. So it went from this So more like this, right, to give that extra feel thing. And then obviously with the rhythm, like I said before, the fact that we have this one on the and of 4, and it's an unconventional note to be used there for the sake of outlining the harmony, you put it all together, and it just kind of creates that interesting effect rhythmically, right? And obviously the articulation is important. It's hard for me to get that, the first couple of notes by themselves. And from a guitar technical point of view, if you're going to use this fingering, I know I'm not talking about fingerings today. Thank God! One of the hardest things for me to actually do in this phrase is when I'm coming from here to the E7 there and landing on that. Basically going from this note and skipping over the 2 strings to that note without getting any unwanted string noise. That's the trickiest part of this phrase for me, from a technical perspective at least. Alright, so hopefully, I know I'm rambling a lot now, but hopefully a lot of that makes sense in terms of as good as all these devices can be, the syncopation, the 16th note triplets, you know, the notes that are syncopated, that are tied to 16th note triplets, the unconventional notes on the downbeats, even the harmony, like I said before, always using a sharp 9 or, you know, augmented. As cool as these things might be, it's literally just me starting with a sound in my head that I'm trying to work out, and basically whatever it is, and it's really just coming from the divine, and, you know, hopefully I can make something that sounds good, right? Anyway, I'm gonna leave this here for today. I hope that you found this interesting. If anyone has any questions or anything they want to say, please put it in the comments. I'm here to help. And in the next episode, hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey! I was thinking about maybe doing another random fun little video like this first, but I am planning on eventually wrapping up this topic that I've been staying on for a long time lately, with working on chordal material with the focus on the body component, getting it into the hands, and even just in general, hopefully by the end of this year, it should be done with that massive topic that I seem to have spent a whole year talking about somehow with these videos of working on things from a technical component and all that. But we will be eventually getting to talking more so about the mind component, as I like to see it, very soon, so that should be exciting. So that's it. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like and consider becoming a subscriber as well as a contributor to Patreon. We'll get all the PDFs on this channel for only $5 a month. And if you think anyone else would enjoy this content, please share it with them as well. And I'll see you guys in episode 88.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about. I try to help you.